Thank you very much, Boris. This was eye-opening. I didn't know that so much work is being done here in Israel, working on a global scale problem. So thank you for your group for that. Our next speaker is Ian. Ian, are you here? He's here. Okay. It's good to see you. So we have Ian Evans. For OneTrust. OneTrust is doing a lot of work around creating trust in cloud, monitoring things, managing risk with partners and supply chain. And Ian is about to tell us a little bit about what they're doing in this area. So good luck and thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Enjoy. Thank you. Morning, everybody. As I wake everybody up, I just flew in, so we had a horrific night of flying. But we avoided a lot of security issues until I got to the... I don't want to disclose the airline, they're a customer. But I'm here. So I'm here with about 20 minutes to spare before we got going. So I want to talk about privacy and third-party risk. So in the room, do we have anybody that heads up vendor risk, third-party risk, inherent risk to companies? Anybody in the privacy space? Okay. So OneTrust is a privacy management platform, and we look at all of the evolving regulation of how privacy is really changing our organizations and the things that we need to be aware of. And when we look around, people can look at privacy in a very discrete way. It's about protecting the rights of individuals and how we track personal information that we store in an organization about the data subject. But when we think about our organization, there are things that we have to do about our technical security organizational measures. There's also an article called Article 28 for third-party risk. Now, interestingly, a year ago, as the GDPR came into force, nobody cared about Article 28. Everybody's more worried about Article 30, records of processing activity, Article 32, technical organizational security measures, Article 35, DPIA, the PIA process. But Article 28 is about our vendors. And then all of a sudden, 1 year on, just under 70% of all breaches that are reported to the regulator come from third parties. So interestingly enough, the whole world woke up about 6 months ago and it saw big news coming through that actually this third party thing is bigger than we thought. So when you think about an organization, so I just flew in with an airline, it'll have somewhere between 4,500 and 6,000 third-party vendors. Every time that airplane takes off the ground, it'll have about 100 different individuals from different organizations walking around with a manifest. That's got my information, it's got my passport, my date of birth, it's got my home address, it's got my flight ticket number, anybody else in the party. It's high-risk data. So when we think about this, we have to think about who are we sharing our data with? How do we check how secure they are? What are they doing to protect the data? Because we're entrusting them. So the words controller and processor come through in GDPR. But how are we protecting the data subjects for that data? Because that's one of our obligations. And whilst GDPR isn't a global regulation, it is a global regulation because we all deal in global markets and therefore we all have data subjects from around the world. So we have to think about the impacts. We have to also think about the impacts of other regulations that are changing around the world as well. And it's the fastest changing space. Privacy is the one that has the biggest impact from a global perspective. So let's look at the drivers, let's look at the challenges. What do we need to do? So first of all, as an organization, we have to think about regulatory change and all of the changes that are impacting our ability to do business. These regulations aren't here to stop us doing business. They're here to make sure that we understand the line and we don't cross that line of protecting the individual data. So we've got to think about how do we protect individuals' data against data breach. Essentially, trust. How are we trusted as an organization to do our job, but to do our job and protect the people who want to deal with us? And then we also have these public expectations to meet. So are we acting responsibly? Do we understand the vendors that we use? If there's a breach in the ecosystem of our of our organization? Do we act very quickly? Are we transparent? Do we report against it? All of these things start to change the way that we think about how we hold data and how we process data. But then behind the scenes, the GDPR came out, but that was one of the many things that happened in the last 24 months. Also, the California Consumer Privacy Act, the Do Not Sell Data Act. So once we trust a company with my data, we can't just go and sell it. The give to get, as it used to be called in America, is moving away. So I can't just give you my data. You can't just make money from it. Okay, there are certain obligations you have to act on. The NYDFS is the new New York State directive around protecting cybersecurity regulations, but there's also one in Brazil for South America. We're seeing organizations post inadequacy. So as in Israel has an adequacy to GDPR, we're also seeing lots of other countries saying, we need to get adequate. We need to get stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 adequate. Some organizations in the Middle East are posting the 95 directive and changing that with some GDPR language, and then looking at the stage 2 to become a GDPR compliant country. So all of a sudden we have all this big push to how do we get trust, how do we protect our data? But this is why the news became full of organizations that had data breaches. Some of these are old, some of these are new. But if we think about the Marriott, anybody's a member of the Marriott or any of the affiliates that it bought, 500 million data subjects data breached. That's your name, your address, your date of birth, your passport number, and your credit card. You don't need much else. When we think through to all of these other breaches that went out there, we have the MyFitnessPal, 150 million records of MyFitnessPal. So if you've got life insurance or health insurance and all of a sudden you're seeing some strange behavior and you've got a MyFitnessPal account and then you've got to make a claim and they say, well, you didn't tell us you had high blood pressure for 6 months. We didn't know all these things, but you didn't disclose it. But now we have that data about you because we have those records. Just think about how that works. And I don't think anybody in this room is a Facebook user. I haven't ever been a Facebook user. I'm proud that I was never a Facebook user, but 50 million users of Facebook hacked. And this is only just being uncovered now. So we took this social networking effect. It took over the way that we communicate with others and how we post our information. And all of a sudden, that data is compromised. So depending on what you post, depends on the level of threat. So what do we need to do about managing the public expectation? Because the challenge is the public they're being informed and they're being trained about the impact of these data breaches. They know their rights. I was in Germany in May last year, and the television had GDPR adverts. It was teaching people about their rights under the GDPR. Now in Germany, they had something called the Datenschutzgesetz for 10 years prior to GDPR. So everybody knew that privacy was a big thing. You couldn't cold call, 50,000 euro fines for cold calling. But they have television adverts to teach you the rights of the data subject under GDPR. So almost there's a campaign going on that people become educated. And when we did a survey in the US, 67% of people support the fact that they're moving away from this information freedom into, I want people to protect my data. And the US is the most free-giving country of information. If you go to try and sign up on Wi-Fi, you've almost got to give your passport number. But you'll sign up because free Wi-Fi is better than anything else you can get. And all of a sudden now, people are saying, well, I need to protect my information as well. I can't just sign up to a Google account on my Android phone and then have that data sold to thousands of people. I need to know where it goes. So what are we facing? Well, first of all, huge amount of information. So even if you think about a small organization, we all have third parties and they all have sub-processors and fourth parties, data centers, obligations, and how they run. So we're now responsible for understanding what another company is going to do. So in fact, you need to make them responsible to comply with your program. And then you've got to think about the communication with these vendors as well, because essentially both internally and externally, there's a big disconnect between what are they doing and what am I doing. So a year ago, if you were running a company and you were providing service to somebody in the cloud and you felt like, I'm going to switch away from Amazon Web Services, I'm going to go to Microsoft. You can't do that today. You have to advise every company about the sub-processing activities in your organization. And depending on how you write your contracts, you may need to ask their permission. Otherwise, you've just breached their compliance to privacy. So all of a sudden, you've changed the way that their records of processing activities work. So now there's this obligation, this chain obligation in a company. And then we have to monitor all of these vendors. Why do we have to monitor all these vendors? There was a company that provided an EPOS system to Saks Fifth Avenue. And I imagine if you're in the market to buy an EPOS system and Saks Fifth Avenue is running one of these beautiful EPOS till systems, it's going to be an amazing reference. But the 3 weeks running up to the Christmas period, they had a little line of code inserted that took over 500,000 credit card details and posted them into the dark web. So now we all need to know that that vendor in their ecosystem had a breach. Therefore, if that vendor's in my ecosystem, how do I proactively protect myself against those impacts? And there are easy ways of doing this, but there's a lot of complication of how do we get to that. There's a huge amount of information. There's a sprawling amount of information out there. We can search the internet, we can find information, but generally, you can't do much with this information. You have to essentially ask a structured set of questions to a vendor to figure out what are they doing about protecting the service that you buy. And the context of the service you buy is important because there'll be public information about a company like IBM or SAP, but the service that you take from them will be very different. So you have to think about the context of the service you take as well. So when I'm pulling data about a service provider, in what context am I using it and does it match? And the really easy one is when we surveyed organizations, and there were less than 20% of companies that had the right certificate loaded in their system. So when they had an ISO 27001 certificate or a SOC 2 certificate, when we looked at the purpose behind the certificate and the service that they were buying from that organization, they didn't match. But from a ticking the box perspective, the company had an ISO 27001, so they ticked the box. It just didn't cover anything they were buying from the company. So we have to think about how do we do that? And then what most people do is they do this data processing agreement. Anybody using data processing agreements at the moment? It's essentially a way of you trying to insure against the risk of third-party issues. But the GDPR states you can't just insure against third-party issues. You can't just say, there's a risk that I might get a 4% fine, and therefore I'm going to make sure that you've got an unlimited liability against that fine, because there's a balancing test. So when the regulator gets involved, they say, well, this fine isn't directly apportioned to the third party because you didn't do anything to check that they were actually compliant to that regulation either. So then we have to think about the right contacts. And this becomes quite hard, and even in a company. So my company is only 3 years old. And we actually struggle to find the right contact because when we make a partnership with somebody, it's somebody in sales. And then the next part of that relationship is somebody in finance because either we're paying them or they're paying us. And then we probably have to do an information security review and make sure that we've got one of their CISOs responding. And then realistically, the service is working. So everybody just gets on with running the service. But the challenge is when something goes wrong, there's a different set of people that you want in the room. And part of our obligation here is figuring out if something goes wrong and we only have 72 hours to figure out what went wrong, how to fix it, how to report on it and tell the public. We want the right people in the room as soon as we know. So we need to figure out how to triage and stem the bleeding, how to figure out what the impacts are, do we need to notify people or not, how to rectify the problem, and how are we going to report this problem, because in the event that we have to make a public announcement, then we need to know the right announcement we're going to make. So this is all about getting the right assessments, and we work with the Cloud Security Alliance to make sure we have standardized assessments, that we understand the breadth of the solution that we are using and the third party, and all of the contacts that we need to work on in our processes. And then we can revalidate all that data, which allows us then to figure out from that third party, what are the fourth parties? Where are the data centers? Where are we handing data off to? Where are they offloading some of that processor capability? Where could we get a data breach? So the GDPR talks about records of processing activity, and that's where we hold the personally identifiable information in our systems. Essentially, that means we're storing it somewhere. We're either storing it on paper in a filing cabinet, we're storing it in a computer system. It's either a first party or it's a third party. So if it's a third party, where's the data being held and how's it being stored? And if we identify a data breach, how do we know who to bring into the room with us and how to take effect on it as quickly as we can? And then alerts. So now you've onboarded a vendor, it's working, but you're blissfully unaware that that vendor's also had other issues with a certain release in the cloud, they've had a data breach, it's public, but unless you're monitoring this, and you can use RSS feeds and bits and pieces to start trying to pull data from the internet, but how are you going to do that in a way that you can manage? So let's look at how most companies address this challenge. And we have about 3,000 customers now using the OneTrust platform. The vendor risk management tool is one of the newest pieces. The standard response is this. We build spreadsheets. I'm like, okay, so you add another set of data to the data you already have to create a graph, and then what do you do with it? We just add more spreadsheets, okay? And this is the sort of the human reaction to this data, okay? Where does the problem lie? I don't know, but I've got a spreadsheet that I can start to figure out and how to pivot and whatever else. But what are you doing about it? And how do you know what it relates to? And we all do this, right? So this is no different to anybody else. We all figure out how we do this. And then the answer is because there are lots of different bits of system that we require in order to run our companies. And bits of this vendor data sits all over the place. It's not just a contract management system or a procurement system, but there's also project management systems. So we have to think about how do we pull this data together and look at the process of identifying that risk. So first of all, standardized assessments. Why do we do standardized assessments? A, we have a framework, we can follow the assessment, we can understand the risk. If we understand the risk, then we can produce a risk register, mitigation plan. If we need to offboard a vendor because it's too high risk or we need to put in a security measure, then we can do that. But the more we can choose a standard, then the better the reporting is going to get. Once we've got a standard, we can use an exchange. Tell me what's changed. If I use a standard and I'm using a vendor, so I'm using Dell EMC, only because you came before me. But if I'm using Dell EMC, how many different product lines are there? Now, I used to work for VMware, so I know how many product lines there are. But there are tens and tens of product lines. So the purpose that I have with that company needs to be defined. Because I need to understand that if Dell's ISO 27001 and I go 6 layers down in the organization to the AirWatch security product that I built, was that security accredited to ISO 27001? It wasn't. But the parent company was. So is that good enough? I need to understand that piece. But also, if I've got an exchange and there's pre-completed templates, then I can just go and pull the pre-completed templates from the last 30 days. Because it wouldn't have changed much in the last 30 days. So now my exchange is giving me information. Also, if we have a standard template, then we can use chasing services because the template's standard. And I can go and chase that vendor to get a completion of their security survey. And then I can put it into the exchange. So the next company that asks for it can pull it out of there as well. So this exchange just grows and grows and grows. And then monitoring becomes easy because we're using a standard. And then we're using an exchange. So we understand everybody that lives in this ecosystem. And then we're able to go and do the monitoring on behalf of companies. And we can find out if a certificate is about to expire. And then we can let you know there's a new one that's been posted and we can update your records. Or if there's been a breach, we could let any company that's using a standard process know that there's been a breach in their ecosystem and they should just check how that service is running. So here's the sort of risk life cycle that goes with vendor management. And I'll quickly talk about why this becomes important. So onboarding. This is very typical. Kind of a typical set of software companies that help us through this third-party risk vendor onboarding process. We have a procurement portal, an Ariba, an Oracle, however we go through. And essentially, I want to do business with somebody, they'll send me a link, I'll fill in some sort of questionnaire, survey, upload my banking details, and then I get a vendor approval notification. And then we go to another system which produces a contract. And that contract will be a commercial contract. But that contract should be also amended to have obligations about, in the event of offboarding, the data destruction routines that I have that are all legally processed. Or in the event of a breach, how do we respond together? And then we pass that into a GRC system to look at general risk. And then we have many systems in here, but essentially what we want to do is find out what are these systems that are talking together, how do they link together, and also what's the risk between these systems. And then we'll have project management tools, like a Jira, which will start to look at modifications to these systems. So anybody that's out there and implementing ServiceNow as a platform will have multiple projects to try and fit ServiceNow into your business. Therefore, the platform that you bought is a different platform and purpose than the one you've implemented. Therefore, we need to figure out if that's right as well. And then we also have our ticketing systems to manage that system internally, manage the access, manage the control, manage the change, whatever we're doing with that. So when we onboard, how do we get rid of these sort of spreadsheets? So first of all, we want vendors to have a self-service portal. We already have a ton of information publicly about what a vendor does. There's a huge amount of information out there on the internet. There's also all of this, the former sort of safe harbor data that was registered as well. But giving them the ability to update that data, comply to a standard, allows us to be faster and more agile in our businesses. Making sure that we integrate to whatever the other systems are as well, because this data already exists, but the data has a purpose in those other systems. It doesn't give us a broad overview of what that data is doing for us in a company. And then we need to bulk import this data, bring it together in one place and say, what do we know about the vendor? But it's not just what do we know about the vendor, it's also what does that vendor do for our business? So if you link this in to your records of processing activity for privacy, you'll know every vendor that holds PII data in your organization and the journey of collecting it and where in that life cycle does it sit. And if I had to respond to something, where would that be? Due diligence is a part that we talked about a little bit here. Does the certificate match the purpose that I already have in place? What other credentials do they have? So we can start avoiding this starting from scratch, building up a repository, because we have an exchange. We want to make sure that our certs match the scope of service that we have, and also, is it current or not? When's it actually expiring? Do we know when it's expiring? Do we need the coverage for it? And then we can start looking at leveraging third-party resources and information to go and look through this. So we have these chasing services that will do this for people and start chasing down these answers to make sure that you have a complete picture of a vendor that's working for you. When we have an issue, we need a process. That process doesn't mean that every time we have an issue, we have to tell a regulatory authority we've had an issue. It could be a security issue that we can deal with in-house. It could be a minor issue. It may not have any detrimental risk or harm to a data subject, or it may. So you need multiple workflow use cases to say, what kind of issue am I having? What do I need to do to respond? Now, at the point that you ask that question, you've become aware. And that's when the 72-hour clock starts ticking under GDPR. So now we're aware. We have to think about what's the issue? How do I respond? How do I report it? In the CCPA, one of the obligations of the CCPA is that if there's anything in your ecosystem that has a breach, you also have to report the prior 12 months of breaches for that system as well. So you need to know anything that's happened from a security or an informational breach that goes with that. We need to think about risk scoring, and we can only do that with a standard. If we don't have a standard, then our scoring is just going to be very ad hoc. So we need to think about the risk scoring, and then you need to ask your organizations, what's your appetite for risk? And I sit through multiple board meetings and I ask for the risk register and I get 6, 7, 8 items of risk in a board meeting. And then I normally ask for where the real risk register is, because there's definitely not 6 or 7 items in any company. There's going to be tens of items all mushrooming out of these issues. But How do you know if you're not reporting them or if you're not recording them in a standard way? And then I talked about vendor chasing services, but you're also here to run your businesses. So chasing vendors is a laborious process. And some people spend months chasing vendors. So if you can avoid chasing vendors, it's a best practice. Now, let's look at what do we do once we understand the relationship of where we hold data, what we're using the data for and its purpose, whether it's a first party or a third party asset. If it's a third party, do we have a contract? We need to understand now what's the level of accountability that this third party has in the organization, because under the new regulations, we both have fines. I'm responsible for outsourcing a process. I can't turn around and say, it wasn't me. I asked that company to do something on my behalf, and my obligation is that I vetted that company and its security and its obligations to the regulation. So my data flows need to be mapped. I need to know how I inherit the data, where the data resides, their data center, my data center, what am I doing with it? And if in the event that I have to part company, how do I act and how do I change that? Because our businesses change as well. And if somebody takes a vendor out of your ecosystem and doesn't tell you, then all of your records of processing activity are wrong, because now what you thought you had for a data map is wrong. So then if you bring that into a tool and we understand it in one holistic view, we can understand where any one vendor holds data, across how many processes do they hold data, what's the impact if that vendor goes out of business or they have a breach, how many other things does it affect? And then we can start figuring out what risk do we have. Essentially, vendor consolidation is the next phase of what third-party risk management is about. And how do I minimize my risk through consolidation? Monitoring, standardized, looking at compliance of the processes, its sub-processes, its hierarchy, making sure they understand the obligations, reporting that to you. And then we've got to think about information privacy updates and regular occurrences. We have an ongoing obligation not to do this once, but to figure out how we do this based on the risk of that processing obligation to our organization. So high risk, maybe you'll do that on an annual basis to make sure that nothing's changed. Lower risk, you might downgrade that to 24 months, 36 months, depending on the type of contract that you have. So scheduling these assessments, otherwise you have another spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet just tells you the occurrence that people will be reassessed, but that doesn't link into any assessment tool. So then you're really looking through that to figure out, when shall I be doing these? Offboarding is just as important. Onboarding is important because if you onboard a vendor, there's either a new record of processing activity or the record of processing activity is changed because there's a new vendor involved. Offboarding is the same, because I've got data sitting out there with a third party, and I need to find out what to do with that data and make sure that I act lawful with that data. So working with the third party, understanding where the data resides, making sure we're compliant to the offboarding obligations. This usually sits in a data processing agreement. This is the right place for a data processing agreement. So when I look at data and I look at a map and I can look at related items, I can see the data protection agreement, data processing agreement, and understand my obligations. But most organizations don't keep them together. They're held in a contract system, they're held on a SharePoint system. You've got to go and find them. Makes it harder. And then you've got to also hold evidence of offboarding a vendor and how you acted and how you took away the data, and you made sort of certain safeguards around that. So if a regulator comes in and says there was a complaint 3 months ago, but I offboarded a vendor in between, that's great because maybe you saw the threat proactively and you offboarded the vendor, but they're still going to come back and ask, what happened? What did you do? Where is the data? What's the process you followed? Becomes vitally important. So that's one of the pieces that our product does, and we're just outside the door. We'd love to talk to anybody about really how do we manage data, visibility, the governance of a regulation. It's not just GDPR. It could be HIPAA. It could be anything to do with any regulatory data, ISO, etc. So we have 4 pillars to our product. One is the privacy program, where we look at maturity and benchmarking. Am I ready for CCPA? And if I'm not ready for CCPA, what do I need to do? Because we have a lot of guidance that allows you to figure out where the gaps are. It's a gap analysis tool, essentially. We have a proactive research tool called Data Guidance that we bought about 3 months ago that tells you how the law tables change. So if I think about the data retention of employment documents in Israel, how is that different to France and Germany and the UK? And this tool will tell you the differences so you can understand how to build your processes and how to build your guidance around that. Our assessment automation essentially is a scheduling tool for assessments of PIAs, DPIAs, InfoSec surveys, and then we map that into our data mapping tool so we know where that data lives. And then if in the event that somebody comes to you and says, tell me what you know about me, we have a target data discovery tool that allows us to go and search all the systems that it knows about and tell you how much data you hold on behalf of a data subject. So we're trying to take the guessing out of this. We have a privacy marketing tool. So as we know, cookies and the e-privacy directive is still not published, about a year later than we thought it would be, but it's coming. And we're seeing various different fines going through the market about websites and marketing organizations. So understanding all the rules about opting in on websites to cookie compliance, understanding all the mobile apps. So it's interesting, but mobile apps, and we're here in Israel, and there's a huge amount of mobile apps developed in Israel. So what we do in mobile apps is we just push a new version to the App Store and we change the license agreement. That isn't how consent works, but it gets us out of worrying about that piece for now. So we need to do the same thing with a mobile app as we do for a website. There should be consent. Do you consent to your data? What is the purpose of your data? It's a kind of laborious way of thinking about it because people want to download an app and get going with it, but actually it's an obligation of consent. So then we have to think about consent preference centers because the data subject has the right to view what consent that you hold on their behalf and whether they want to renew it or they can redact it. Because they also have rights and fulfilling their rights as a data subject about the right to be viewed, the right to be changed, and the right to be erased or port your data becomes key. Vendor risk sits out here in one of our newer services. So looking at vendor assessments, standardized assessments, chasing services, vendor exchange, making sure we understand what's going on in that world about our third parties. Because typically it links to the fourth pillar, which is we've had an incident, and now we need to figure out how do we resolve it and how do we respond to it. So a template, how do we intake incidents? What type of incident is it? Security or is it privacy? We have these things called PDIAs, which are unfortunate, but we have something called Cookiepedia, which has 8 million classified cookies. We have Vendorpedia, which has hundreds of thousands of vendors' details in there around the world and growing. And then we also have something called Data Breachpedia with over 300 different types of templates of how I should respond to a data breach. But it's not just the template. It also looks into your records of processing activity over here and says, you might be in Israel, but you've just outsourced this process to France because the third party's in France. And now you've got to report to the CNIL in France. And this is the template that you should follow because now the data processing has moved. So notification, tracking, real-time activity feeds, all of these become really enforcement to prove the transparency, your accountability levels within the new regulations. So I'm going to try and wrap it up on time. We're outside, literally. We're going to trip people up so we can talk to you all. But right by the door, there's a green book on our stand, which is the GDPR. Please just take one. Have a look at it. Come to our stand if you want to see any more detail. We'll happily show you a live system and show you how we track and how this looks. It doesn't take very long at all. We also do run our own privacy events as well. We just ran one recently, but Tel Aviv is big for us. We run these in 70 different countries around the world. So if you want to sort of join in on the conversations as well, please take a look at privacyconnect.com and sign up. They're free. You can attend and we'll talk more about how privacy is sort of affecting our organizations. And with that, I'll say thank you.